I was born to be harvested. My parents had my sister Holly first. She was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 4. They tried everything from chemo, radiation, experimental treatments. Nothing worked long term. Her cancer kept coming back, each time more aggressive than before. When this happened for the billionth time, my parents decided to have a savior sibling. Basically, they'd have another child, me, who would be a perfect genetic match to provide bone marrow, blood, and whatever else Holly needed. I found out that I was only born to be her organ donor when I was 7. Before that, I just thought all kids spent half their lives in hospitals getting poked with needles. I didn't know any different. My earliest memory is being in a hospital bed. I must have been about 3. I remember crying because my arm hurt from where they took blood. The needle seemed enormous to my toddler eyes, and the pinch felt like fire running through my veins. My mom was there, but she wasn't comforting me. She was just checking her watch and asking the nurse how much longer it would take. As soon as they were done, she rushed me out of there to get back to Holly, not even pausing to wipe away my tears or offer a reassuring hug. That was pretty much how it always went. Holly was the real child. I was just a walking pharmacy. The difference in the way they treated us was stark. Despite me being healthy, I never had birthday parties growing up. Holly did though, whenever she was well enough. She'd have big ones with all her friends from school and tons of presents wrapped in shiny paper with colorful bows. I was never allowed to join because I might expose Holly to germs after one of her treatments, so I just watched from the stairs. I sat there for hours, hugging my knees to my chest, watching other children laugh and play games while my parents fawned over Holly. My birthdays usually involved a trip to the hospital for some kind of donation procedure. Maybe a small cake afterward if I didn't cry too much during whatever they did to me that day. Once when I turned 8, the nurse snuck me a cupcake with a candle. She let me make a wish before my parents came back to the room. I wished for someone to love me for me. I used to try really hard in school, thinking maybe if I got good grades my parents would notice me for something other than my matching blood type. I brought home an award for a science project in 2nd grade. I'd spent weeks working on a detailed model of the solar system with hand-painted planets and carefully measured orbits. My mom glanced at it and said, "That's nice," before asking if I'd taken my iron supplements because they needed to draw more blood that weekend. The certificate ended up crumpled at the bottom of my backpack. I stopped trying after a while. Holly wasn't nice to me either. When she felt good, which wasn't often, she'd find ways to remind me why I existed. She'd call me her walking medicine cabinet, or spare parts. Once when I was about 6, I found her going through my dresser. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was checking what was hers. She told me my kidneys, my bone marrow, and my blood all belonged to her. I believed her for years. Sometimes at night I'd stay awake wondering which parts I might lose next. I couldn't have friends over either to escape the loneliness I felt because our house revolved around Holly's health. Everything was sterilized constantly. My parents were terrified I'd catch something and then wouldn't be able to donate. I basically lived in a bubble, but not for my protection, for hers. I remember one girl from school, Lily, who wanted to come over to play. When I asked my mom, she looked horrified and lectured me for an hour about how selfish I was being, risking Holly's life for something as trivial as friendship. By the time I was 9, things got worse. I overheard the doctors talking to my parents about a partial liver transplant. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I knew it sounded scary and permanent. The thought of surgeons cutting me open and taking out a piece of my organ made me sick with fear. I tried telling my teacher at school that I was scared about an operation. She just patted my head and said sometimes we have to do things we don't want to for the people we love. That's when I realized nobody was going to help me. I was completely alone in this. My parents never bothered to explain the procedures to me beforehand. They'd just wake me up and say, "We're going to the hospital today." I'd find out what they were doing to me when I was already there, already dressed in the hospital gown. The doctors would try to explain things to me sometimes, but my parents would cut them off and say I'd already consented. I don't think the doctors liked it, but they never stopped it either. I remember this one time when I was 10, I had to have bone marrow extracted. If you've never experienced that, consider yourself lucky. They stick this huge needle into your hip bone. It hurts like hell, even with local anesthetic. I was crying and begging them to stop. The pain was like nothing I'd ever felt before, like someone was drilling into my very core. My mom just stood there telling me to be brave for Holly. Not for me, for Holly. After it was over, they went straight to Holly's room. I was left alone with a nurse who looked sorry for me but didn't say anything. I stayed there crying and wondering if anyone would notice if I just disappeared. The only person who ever treated me like a real person was my Aunt Sarah. She's my mom's sister, and she's a nurse. She didn't live nearby, so I only saw her a couple times a year at family gatherings. But whenever she came, she'd bring me presents, just for me, not shared with Holly. She'd ask about my interests, my friends, not that I had many, what books I liked to read, normal aunt stuff that felt extraordinary to me. She'd brush my hair gently and tell me I was beautiful, smart, and important. When I was 11, we had a big family Thanksgiving dinner. Holly was doing okay that month, so everyone came to our house. I remember Aunt Sarah watching me closely during dinner. I wasn't allowed to eat certain foods before procedures, so I was picking at plain turkey while everyone else had all the sides. After dinner, she found me alone in the hallway and asked if I was okay. Something about the way she asked made me start crying. I told her about the constant hospital visits, how I was scared about the liver thing they kept mentioning, how nobody ever asked if I wanted to do these things. I didn't know it then, but that conversation changed everything. Aunt Sarah started visiting more often after that. She'd bring me little gifts and take me for ice cream when my parents would allow it, which wasn't often since sugar was bad for my system, according to them. During these visits, she'd ask casual questions about my medical procedures. I didn't realize she was gathering information. One day when I was 12, I overheard my parents arguing with Aunt Sarah in the kitchen. She was saying words like unethical and exploitation. My dad yelled that she had no right to judge them when she'd never had a dying child. My mom was crying, saying they were just doing what they had to do to save Holly. Aunt Sarah said, "But at what cost? Mia is a child, not a resource." I pressed myself against the wall outside the kitchen, heart pounding, both terrified and strangely hopeful that someone was finally fighting for me. After that fight, Aunt Sarah wasn't allowed to visit anymore. My parents told me she was causing problems and needed to mind her own business. I felt more alone than ever. The one person who saw me as Mia, not Holly donor, was gone. I started keeping a journal hidden under my mattress, writing letters to Aunt Sarah that I could never send. A few months later, there was a knock at our door. I opened it to find Aunt Sarah with a woman in a suit who introduced herself as someone from Child Protective Services. My parents went ballistic. My dad tried to physically block them from entering, and he was red in the face. My mom grabbed me and pulled me behind her, screaming at Sarah that she was calling Holly. It was chaos. I remember standing there, frozen in shock, as the adults shouted over each other. I was taken to another room with the CPS woman while the adults argued. She asked me questions about my life, my medical procedures, if I understood why they were done, if I'd ever been asked for my consent. I answered honestly because no one had ever really asked me these things before. I showed her my arms with all the needle marks. I told her about the bone marrow extractions, the blood draws, the talk of taking part of my liver next. That was the beginning of what turned into a huge legal battle. I didn't understand most of it at the time. There were court hearings where I had to talk to a judge in private. Medical ethics experts testified. My parents brought in Holly doctors who said she would die without my donations. Aunt Sarah brought in child psychologists who talked about the trauma I was experiencing. The worst part was that during all of this, I was still living at home with my parents. They barely spoke to me except to remind me that if Holly died, it would be my fault. It always made me feel guilty, especially since Holly was sicker than ever and spent most of her time in the hospital. When she was home, she'd blare at me and call me a traitor. I started hiding in my closet for hours just to get away from the tension. I remember sitting in that closet with a flashlight, reading books Aunt Sarah had smuggled to me, fantasy stories about kids who discovered they had magical powers or secret identities. I wished so badly that someone someone would come tell me I was actually a princess from another world who had been switched at birth. Anything to escape the reality that I was just a collection of spare parts for someone else. The court case dragged on for months. My parents were fighting with everything they had. They truly believed they were right, that sacrificing one child to save another was the only moral choice. I heard my dad tell the judge, "We created Mia to save Holly. That's her purpose." Like I was a medication they'd invented, not a person. I started having nightmares around this time. I'd dream that I was on an operating table, and doctors were removing pieces of me one by one while my parents watched approvingly. I'd wake up screaming, and no one would come to comfort me. I'd lie there in the dark, heart racing, sweat soaking my pajamas, trying to convince myself that I was still whole. School became my only escape. I threw myself into my studies, staying late in the library just to avoid going home. My grades were perfect, not that my parents noticed. One teacher, Ms. Winters, started paying special attention to me. She'd give me extra books to read and let me eat lunch in her classroom. I think she knew something was wrong, but didn't know how to help. As the court case continued, medical experts testified about something called medical child abuse. I didn't fully understand it then, but they were saying that subjecting me to repeated painful procedures without medical necessity for me was a form of abuse, even if it was helping Holly. They talked about my rights to bodily autonomy and informed consent. My parents' lawyer argued that parents make medical decisions for their children all the time, and this was no different. But the judge asked a question that stuck with me. If Holly needed a heart, would you take Mia's? My father hesitated too long before answering, no, of course not. Everyone in the courtroom could see he was lying. About 6 months into the legal battle, I had my 13th birthday. No one in my family remembered it. Ms. Winters gave me a cupcake at school, and Aunt Sarah sent a card that my parents intercepted. I found it later, torn up in the trash. The next day, the judge made his final ruling. I was immediately removed from my parents' custody and placed with Aunt Sarah as my temporary guardian. I remember the court officer helping me pack a small bag while my mother screamed that I was murdering my sister. My father just sat at the kitchen table staring blankly ahead like he couldn't process what was happening. As I walked out of that house with Aunt Sarah's arm around my shoulders, I felt both terrified and relieved. I had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a medical resource. I was Mia. Aunt Sarah lived in a small apartment about 2 hours away from my parents. It had only one bedroom, so she set up a futon in the living room for herself and gave me the bedroom. I remember being shocked that she'd give up her own room for me. No one had ever put my comfort first before. The first night there, I couldn't sleep. I kept waiting for someone to wake me up for a hospital visit or a blood draw. When morning came and no one had disturbed me, I actually cried from relief. Aunt Sarah found me sobbing and just held me, not asking questions, just being there. That first week was strange. Aunt Sarah asked what foods I liked, what clothes I wanted to wear, what I wanted to do each day. Having choices was overwhelming after a lifetime of being told what to do. I kept asking permission for basic things like using the bathroom or getting a glass of water. Each time, Aunt Sarah would gently remind me that I didn't need permission to meet my own needs. I'd been with Aunt Sarah for about 2 weeks when we got the news that Holly's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Without my donations, her body was rejecting the previous treatments. I felt this weird mix of guilt and relief. Part of me felt terrible that someone was suffering because of me, but another part, a part I was ashamed of, felt validated. Like the court had been right to remove me from that house. Aunt Sarah never pressured me about it. She just told me what was happening in a calm, matter-of-fact way, then asked if I had any questions. When I asked if I was killing my sister by not donating anymore, she sat me down at her kitchen table and looked me straight in the eyes while she said, "Mia, you are not responsible for keeping another person alive at the expense of your own health and well-being, not even your sister." It was the first time